now called to order. We are on Bill 248-34. Before we broke yesterday, Senator Estevez had the floor. However, he asked for a little more time to get his amendments together. And so now we want to recognize Senator Muña for any questions or amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, much more than a question, I really just had a comment on a couple of our colleagues' comments yesterday. And I realized throughout this whole ordeal that every minute changes, and everybody's ideas and changes. I think I've learned more in the last 2.5, 3 weeks about taxes than I have as my entire life as a taxpayer. And so really my comment is based on a couple of the colleagues' comments yesterday about the difference, trying to see the difference between a 2% increase on the BPT and a 2% increase on the sales tax. And I know we were sitting here for so many hours talking about the increase in the BPT, and the consensus that I got, not just from this body here or the administration, but even the taxpayers, is that BPT was not transparent enough, and that these retailers could price gouge. And I think that was one of the concerns that people had, is that they just weren't sure about what 2% would look like on the products that they buy. And another thing too, I realized too, is that if you weren't for the 2% increase, you would call it a 50% increase. And I think, personally, I really believe that that's misleading, because when you say 50% increase, people are led to believe that everything that they purchase is going to be 50% more. And in actuality, it's only 2% more. So now we're sitting here with the sales tax in front of us, the sales tax bill in front of us. And I remember everyone saying that this was more palatable because it was more transparent. You can see it on the receipt at the end of your purchase that this 2% is added on to your purchase. And I appreciate Senator San Augustin's presentation yesterday at the public hearing, and Carlos Camacho's testimony about the case study impact, because I kept trying to wrap my head around what the devastation. I mean, everybody kept saying, oh, it's going to be devastating. 2% is going to be devastating. And when I looked at this case study impact and I saw like food costs and other expenses that total a little over $1,200, and I'm just going to assume that maybe this is a month, right? I don't know anybody who spends $1,200 on food and expenses a month. But a 2% on top of that is only $25. And realistically, if you cut that in half at $600 a month, if somebody spends that much money on food or other expenses, that's 2% increase is only $12. And even if you don't spend $600, if you only spend $300, that's only $6 more. So I keep trying to wrap my head around why people keep saying this is so devastating. I don't understand it. So when I saw it in actual numbers, I started to understand more that maybe it really isn't as devastating as people think it is. They're only led to believe that it is by saying it's a 50% increase. So if it's a temporary solution and it's something that's going to get us through this fiscal crisis at this moment, then I say we should support it and let it happen and get to the next step, because I do believe that the administration wants to balance things out, and they want to do a fiscal realignment. This is our way of contributing to the economy as well. 2%, I don't know, I still can't believe that it's as devastating as people believe it to be. I don't think anybody can tell me that I don't know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. And I remember some dark fiscal times or financial times in my life where I couldn't even make a paycheck to get to the next paycheck. So I'm just trying to understand what's devastating about 2%. When you really look at this case study analysis, $12 out of your $600 that you're going to spend is really not as devastating. So I'm willing to support the sales tax, and I'm also looking forward, Mr. Chair, to hearing what other amendments that we have on this. to get us at least one step closer, and if anything, we can at least finally resolve this today, and that's what I'm looking forward to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Munya. Are there anyone else who has any questions? Or, okay. Senator, are you ready with yours? Not yet. Okay, well, we'll recognize Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment being passed out. It's in support of the recommendation of the director, Mr. John Camacho, that we would amend on page 2, line 13. It's being passed out right now, so. In reference to the rules and regulations. Okay, the amendment is that on 26704 be all striked out currently on the bill and replaced by the general provisions of Title 11 Guam Code Annotated Chapter 26 Article 1 shall apply to this article. And so for do you feel I need to read the whole thing, or I should? Okay. Then also Title 11 Guam Code Annotated Chapter 26 Article 1 Section 26110A is amended to read as follows. Monthly alcohol, it goes down and it adds the general sales tax onto that code. And then when the funds are reported, each taxpayer whom a tax levied by the provisions of Article 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of this chapter shall make and file monthly returns of taxes with the Tax Commission on or before the 20th day following the close of the calendar month in which the tax accrue, and in the form and in accordance with the rules and regulations by the Tax Commissioner, except as may be specifically herein provided, payment covering the full amount of the tax liability as evidenced by monthly return shall accompany such monthly return. My colleagues, it's the same thing as what's going on with the BBT. It's just saying when, it's just identifying when the sales tax must be reported.
Thank you, Senator. There's a motion before us, and it's to amend page 2 of the bill to replace lines 13 through 15 with what we have in front of us. Is there anyone who wished to speak on the motion? Senator Morrison, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment, Mr. Chair, because I believe yesterday, I was kind of concerned looking at the 30 days to promulgate rules, and then I believe you inserted an amendment to have the effective date April 1st. And, you look at the timelines to do this, promulgate rules in 30 days and have the effective date April 1st. I was kind of trying to juggle the timeline day because we're certainly trying to get this measure through and implemented in a reasonable time frame. So I thank the author for this amendment. It clears up having the department to promulgate rules within 30 days and trying to have it effective April 1st. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. Are there any other senators? Senator Tamara?
I guess my question is, and if the author of the mover of the amendment would yield, I guess what I was looking for yesterday is at least I've learned during our discussions here that, for example, under the liquid fuels tax, there's exemption provisions. Under the BPT itself, there's exemptions with respect to the banks, with respect to insurance companies, and so I guess what I was looking for yesterday was with this general sales tax, the way it was worded, at least, was that it was not clear whether, I mean, it's just a blanket thing, right? You're going to have a 2% sales tax on the following: banking services, insurance, and everything else. And so it just raises more questions, like, you know, what part of the banking service do you apply the 2% tax, sales tax to? And I guess this, I don't know if, I guess that's what I was looking for, and I don't see it in here. So maybe if the mover can help me understand.
Senator San Augustine, would you yield to the question?
Yes. I'm working with legal right now that on section 26701 under the levy, there'll be an amendment that will come out that will specifically state that any of the exemptions on the BBT would apply to the sales tax. So that all the questions that you mentioned, that there's other taxes that the BBT don't apply, the sales tax won't apply. In other words, if you're gonna go buy fuel, you don't get taxed for fuel because you're already paying liquid fuel tax. Any other taxes that BBT doesn't apply, it doesn't apply, right? No?
Senator, does that answer your question?
I'll wait for the legal.
Okay. Anyone else on the San Augustine amendment? Senator Torres?
No, I don't have a comment on the amendment itself, but I do have a comment to the other statement. I think what we're doing here is we're mischaracterizing what a sales tax is by that last amendment. So I want to just confirm that, you know, to certain exemptions on a certain type of tax are exemptions on a certain type of, in certain taxes where there are exemptions applied, that applies to only that type of tax. But when you're dealing with separate types of taxes, you don't muddle them. So I don't think that an application of that an exemption in one instance would be an automatic application to another instance. And so I just want to point out that a sales tax is specifically on the purchase of a commodity. So it's a tax on a product that the consumer is assessed. So any other exemptions that would apply on the supply side or, you know, somewhere up the line wouldn't apply in a sales tax, because a sales tax is specifically a consumer tax. So insofar as exemptions, I think that's another area, and where there are exemptions for a sales tax, that would have to be specifically iterated in the statute. So to that point, though, I just want to clarify, because I think we tend to think that you know, you can automatically connect the dots, but I think in a situation where you have a statute specific to the creation of a tax, all the exemptions and all the parameters of that tax are spelled out just in the statute and apply only per the statute. So just to clear it up, we'd have to spell it out. Jesus Masi, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I just want to catch what was apparently maybe a misstatement.
Thank you.
I don't think he meant that.
Thank you, Senator Torres.
And Senator, Mr. Chairman, we do have other amendments that are coming. They're just writing it up to add those other exemptions that we want to apply to avoid the sales tax.
Okay,
Very
thank you. We're still on the First Amendment before us. Senator Estevez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I understand the intent. I just don't think that it's properly placed because these types of taxes are on specific either items or industries. So if you look at an alcoholic beverage, liquid fuel tax, automotive surcharge, a tobacco tax. But in applying a general sales tax, the positioning of where this is and the rules and regulations, and to refer to what the previous speaker had been talking about as a general provision, and this specific type of tax should really have the provisions in and of itself. If it's repetitive of other statutes currently in law to remain consistent, then it should cite that. But this tax, I believe, I don't think this amendment itself covers the provisions and shows that the rules and regs are the same, because each one of these, alcoholic beverage, liquid fuel tax, automotive surcharge, all of them have their own areas in statute that really spell out the specifics of that particular tax. So I don't think this amendment covers, I don't believe it covers the intent of what the mover of the amendment is looking to do, which is to apply the same rules and regulations. It does, however, supply the date of the filing, but I believe there's still going to be more work that needs to be applied. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Torres had another question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question for Mr. Camacho. This specific section 26704 general provisions, that's only talking about the monthly returns, right? That section's only referencing returns, filing of returns? On the amendment.
On the amendment, there's two parts of the amendment. One is basically, if you go to chapter 26 of Guam Code annotated 11 of the Finance and Taxation, and you go under Article 1, it's basically going to show you all the general provisions that may be used in moving forward the general sales tax. That's why I recommended that we adopt this thing. The other articles also uses this, in addition to what the provisions is saying in the general sales tax.
So if we were to create a sales tax, we would need to include it in this section, right? That's the simple way of...
It's a way of a guidance moving forward. And like I said, these provisions allow myself, the Director or Tax Commissioner, to provide rules and regulations moving forward to any taxes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Camacho.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Esteves, you still had a question?
Yes, back to what we were talking about, similar discussion yesterday, Mr. Chairman. While I understand and I don't have as much confidence that you're going to be able to provide the rules and regulations, I think there are some things that you just, under your purview, are not going to be able to establish in a reasonable time. Do you believe that you'd be able to establish in your rules and regulations and promulgate within 30 days penalties or criminal offenses? Because I don't believe that's in your power to establish criminal offenses for fraudulent tax activity.
These general provisions that we're adopting addresses those penalties and interest. If you look at the general provisions that we're adopting to apply to Article 7, it talks about penalties, interest, or other areas that may apply in adopting the general sales tax. Like other taxes, they look at this, and this is what they guide themselves. If you owe a tobacco or alcohol tax or whatever, these are the guidance that they go to. In other words, to say, okay, you didn't file your tobacco tax and you didn't pay, then there's a penalty and there's interest charge. So likewise with the general sales tax, if something were to be questioned, this is the guidance that will move it forward, in other words. I know there's some, on the regulations, we can expand other areas, but this is at least the administrative part that we need in order to move the general provisions of the general sales tax.
Mr. Chairman, looking at the citation, so adopting of the general provisions in Chapter 26, Article 1, I'm going to have to go back and look at the actual article and that he's referencing to check applicability before I could vote on this measure. So I'd ask for a short recess.
Okay, we'll take a short recess. The Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Esteves, you're
Thank you,
recognized.
Thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I was able to find one inconsistency that I believe is very important to the intent of the bill, which is to generate revenue and try to generate it in an efficient and timely manner. I refer to Section 26110.1 under Article 1 of Chapter 26, which is electronic filing of monthly returns allowed. The provision currently in statute, if we're referencing and trying to apply the rules and regulations, only applies to BPT. So I'd like to proffer an amendment to the amendment, which I don't have prepared, which basically applies the application and allowing of online filing for sales tax to the sales tax, similar to as it does for BPT.
Okay, so can you repeat that? Where are you amending?
I don't have the specific amendment, but I'd like to refer my colleagues to that section, which is Section 26110.1, and that's under the general provisions, Article 1 of Chapter 26, which allows for the filing of online returns. But if you look at that section, it only applies to business privilege tax. So I'd like, if my colleagues don't have an issue with it, that we apply the same to the sales tax and allow for online filing.
Okay. Senators, is there any questions on that, or would you like a written amendment? Okay. There's a request to have it written, Senator, if you could, so we'll put that aside. Is there anyone else on the San Augustine amendment? Is there anyone else on the San Augustine amendment that'd like to speak on it or have any motions? If not, then we're going to have to take another recess to wait for your written amendment, Senator. The committee of the whole is now back on. Senator Esteves, you have the floor. You have an amendment that's been circulated now.
Thank you,
I
Ms.
I understand you want to move this after we dispose of the San Augustine amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I believe it belongs in a different, in its own section outside of this. So at this time, I'll reserve my time.
Okay, we're now on the San Augustine amendment. We're still on the San Augustine. Anyone else have any questions on it or any objections? Senator, would you like to close on your amendment? Are there any objections? No objections. Motion passes. Senator Esteves, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my colleagues have received the amendment I passed out, which is to amend Section 1 to read and add a new section 26709, returns, and which basically takes the language from the BPT and provides a mandate that Rev and Tax provide for the online filing of the sales tax. But it does, however, allow taxpayers subject to the chapter to opt out and continue to file manually. As again, the language is similar or is basically the same as BPT, but it does provide for it for sales tax to allow for efficient and timely payments.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any senators wish to speak on this amendment? Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand that there are some electronic filing mechanisms already in place at the Department of Revenue and Taxation, but because this is could possibly, should this legislation pass, be an additional tax filing, does Rev and Tax presently have the capability to be able to ensure that you're able to implement this?
Yes, we already have the BPT online, basically, and I think we also, because the BPT, I think I got to check. I think it also includes some of the other taxes. I'm just going to look at it, but yes, we have it online already. What we can do is we can, make the amendments to include the general sales tax if this bill passes.
And should this bill pass, then obviously that's a mechanism that you can realize within a time frame.
Yes, we can do that.
Okay. I just wanted to ensure, Mr. Chairman, that we don't impose this on Rev and Tax without at least giving them additional time allowance if it's necessary. But thank you for that assurance. Thank you, Mr. Camacho. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator. Is there anyone else that wishes? Senator Tom Ata?
Mr. Chairman, I was at a tax forum this morning, and somebody had mentioned about the electronic filing, but that there was a fee that the filer has to pay to get on this electronic filing. Can you maybe, do you know anything about that?
I'm not aware of a fee. There's procedures, I believe, that you will need to get a PIN number, communicate with our PIN administrator. For paying, you mean? Oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm talking. There's no fee actually for filing, but if you elect to make payments, I think there is a fee. I think there's something that DOA handles, where if you want to swipe your credit card, there is a fee. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else have anything on this amendment, on this Esteves amendment? Senator? Okay. Are there any objections to the Esteves amendment? No objection. And before we...
Sure.
Yes, Senator Espadon?
Thank you. On the previous question, the only way, if you're going to file electronically, then what I took away from the same forum that Senator Ata attended this morning was that the only way you can pay if you file electronically is by credit card. Is that true, or do you have to file electronically and then go up to Rev and Tax and pay if you don't want to be assessed a fee?
That is true. If you want to pay online, then there's a fee for that.
Right, so
But if you want to go ahead and file it online, then print your tax return and go to Treasury Guam, that's not a problem. A lot of people are doing that now.
okay. Do you anticipate that, well, okay, never mind. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senators on this amendment? If not, before we do, we want to allow the legal counsel to change the section number. I believe this is an incorrect section of the statute. It should reflect sections 26110 of the code. Are there any objections to allowing legal counsel to make those changes? No objection, okay. This motion now passes. Senator Esteves, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm passing out another an amendment with regards to computation, and considering the last recommendation from legal, I do understand there will probably be a correction as to the section, but if we can, I'd like to get this passed around so we can start discussing. And basically what this does, when we're applying a sales tax when we're applying a sales tax, a consumption tax to the consumer, we want to ensure that we're not overtaxing or undertaxing. The difficulty is applying a percentage-based sales tax, or not difficulty, but the caveat to that is applying a percentage-based sales tax on individual items presents for amounts under 1 penny. And so to ensure that we're not overcharging or undercharging with regards to those fractions of a cent, I'm proposing an amendment which will allow, once they compute the sales tax, that it's rounded based on its position. So this just presents, as I understand it and based on my research, the nickel and diming of either the businesses to undercharge or overcharge, because on larger purchases or bundled purchases, they can start to add up. And it's just to ensure the accurate remittance of taxes, both paid and remitted to the government of Guam.
Thank you, Senator. Any senator wish to be recognized? Okay. On this amendment, are there anyone who wish to be recognized on this amendment? No, Senator Esteves.
Oh, did we?
No,
I
that
thought
passed.
we finished with his amendment.
Yes, we did.
It passed.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
This is a new amendment on computations. We're on this amendment now.
Mr. Chairman, maybe we need to finish with this, but we really need to go back to the previous amendment by Senator Esteves on amending section 26110, because the way it's written, it guts, the way I read it, it guts that section on regarding returns, and all it says is that everybody has to file electronically.
Okay, well,
but you know, basically deletes the language about monthly returns for alcoholic beverage, et cetera, et cetera.
okay, we'll come back to that.
All right.
So we'll have this amendment before us now. Are there any senators that wish to be recognized? Are there any objections to this amendment? Senator
Mr.
Espadon?
Chair, let's be deliberate. We're seeing these amendments for the first time, and to pass them without even giving thought to it, I think is a disservice. That being said, I guess the question that would have to follow is whether the point-of-sale systems that are involved at the various stores or outlets or whatnot, whether they have the capability to round down or round up. I mean, if we pass this amendment, and bottom line is saying that if at the end of the day, when you put on the sales tax and you come out with $1.05, $1.0533, then it should be, what will be assessed will be $1.03, right? You're rounding down, and if it, of course, if it's if you round up, the question then becomes: do the establishments in their POS systems have the ability to round up or down?
Senator
Thank you,
Esteves,
Mr.
would you
Chairman.
yield to that question?
Yes, I do. I think for the most part, it's inconsequential in the part that the computation comes to return. So whether the POS system can round up or round down, the responsibility is still there on the return, so that that we're all on the same page of what the actual number is. So even if the point of sale system didn't round up or round down, it's the ability of the business, based on this formula, to round it up or round down, so we're all on the same page. If the POS system does, which this is a standard rounding formula to round up or down, then it would still be inconsequential. But regardless of what the point of sale system does, when the individual files their return, they have to make sure that the amount is consistent with what Rev and Tax is tracking. So a computation model that's across the board for both the businesses and the government, I think, is extra important, because when you start talking about those $1 million deals, the computation and those pennies do add up. So just to make sure, for the benefit of the taxpayer and tax filer and revenue and taxation, I think it's important that the computation of those fraction amounts are all on the same page. So to answer his question, I think it's inconsequential because the return is different from what happens at the point of sale, and the computation is still going to have to happen.
Yeah, if we're talking about sales tax that is going to be visible, right, then it has to happen at the point of sale, not so much at the point of when the business files a return. And that's the question. I understand what he's saying in terms of, okay, when the business does actually file and these are the sales taxes collected, and there it is. But when the customer goes to the store, puts his items on the table, and this amendment would affect that as well, not just the reporting to Rev and Tax, but really the reporting to the customer. And I guess that's why I have a little bit of ambiguity in my mind in terms of how does this play out to the customer, since the sales tax really is now, the tax is now being picked up by the customer. So to me, there's a little bit of a problem there. And again, if we're talking cents, yeah, but when you start getting into a bigger sale and whatnot, how does that reflect to the customer? And if it can't be reflected at the point of sale, then I'm not sure how this amendment could apply.
Okay. So you want to yield to that concern?
I'm just making a point, and if there is perhaps some explanation, I'd like to hear it.
Okay. Senator?
So again, this is probably the most standard calculation for rounding to the whole cent. Whether it's a point of sale system, I think the point of sale systems, and again, this would just be a very simplified assumption, is that the point of sale system is going to calculate what you owe at the register in a whole cent. The only time you probably would start getting into the weeds of the 0.0003 is in finance. That's why I think it's important at the point of sale, that whether it's at the point of sale or the return or the government of Guam, that we're all using a standard calculation and a standard methodology to get to the same whole number, so that when we do start talking about multiple purchases or multiple transactions with larger amounts, that the numbers are going to be consistent across the board, as long as everyone's using the same calculation for getting to the whole cent, if that answers his question.
I understand rounding. We all understand rounding. Again, the issue still stands. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Tom Atta, and then Senator Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a little confused by the format. I mean, just the presentation of the amendment here. All it says is to amend Section 1 to read, and I guess I have to guess that we are adding a new Section 26707 regarding computation.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I did say when the amendment was passed out that we realized that the errors in the amendments that had already been printed out, that it's not to amend, but that should be to add, consistent with what legal had previously stated as we discovered on the last amendment. I can go back and make the correction, and we can print out another 100 sheets to present the amendment. But I thought, again, I apologize about that error, but I did make note that legal had identified it and that it would just be adding to the current statute. None of the amendments proposed are to just replace it in its entirety.
Mr. Chairman, these are documents that are kept on record. And there may be times down the road when we need to go back and, figure out what was really said, what was intended. So I think let's do it right, and I don't think you have to print 100 sheets. There's only 15 of us in here. So I would ask that, let's do it correctly, because these are documents that are kept in the records. I know that the one you said on regarding returns, was that at section 26706 again? So I say let's do it right.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. Senator Nicholas, did you have a?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The amendment is very problematic. I think the intent of the author is to have the tax amount based on the sale price rounded to the nearest whole cent. The way this is written, when the sale price involves a fraction of a dollar, the tax computation must be carried to the third decimal place, then rounded down to the next whole cent whenever the third decimal place is 1, 2, 3, 4, and rounded up to the next whole cent whenever the third decimal place is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. First of all, the first part of the sentence, when the sale price involves a fraction of a dollar, anything that sells for like $1.50, that's a sale price that involves a fraction of a dollar. And now he's trying to specify how the tax computation must be carried to the third decimal place. The tax computation is 2%. There is no third decimal place in the tax computation. And so I think that the intent is to round the assessed tax to the nearest whole cent. That could be much more simplified, but before we even go out and mandate that, I wanted to ask the Director of Revenue and Taxation, because we do have a gross receipts tax. When the gross receipts tax assessment results in an amount due that involves a fraction of a cent, how does the taxpayer handle that? Do they round it up? Do they round it down?
I guess basically the systems that they have, I believe if the tax is 4%, whatever the amount, whether it's a whole number or with cents, I mean, whatever that comes out, that will be the tax, basically. I guess when it comes to reporting the monthly gross receipts tax, I think maybe it's a point where you accumulate all those the amount that was earned, or I mean what that was sold. For example, if this is a sale times 4%, and this is the total that was actually to be paid over to the government, I think if there's a decimal point there, maybe those are things that maybe some of them will put the cent, some of them will run it off if it's a whole number. I think that's something that most people do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the GRT side, because the business reports it,
yes,
it's based on what they report, that's what
yes,
they pay. What we're trying to figure out now is, because the sales tax is going to be assessed at the point of sale, if there is a fraction of a cent, how is that going to be determined? And so I'm of the mind that the easier, I mean, it's just easier for us to just say anything, it'll be rounded down to the nearest whole cent. I mean, that'll be easier for all the systems, versus having to, if it's 4 or less and if it's 5 or up. Because, I mean, to even take half a penny of tax more from somebody who only owed half a penny, you're overtaxing them. So I would be of the mind that it should just be policy that you just round down to the nearest whole cent. Because to round up means you're taking more tax from them than they are actually supposed to pay. So that's just my contribution, Mr. Chairman. The amendment as written does not satisfy the intent And the intent, I don't think, is aligned with fair application of tax policy, because to charge somebody more tax than what they've mathematically owed is actually an overtaxation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Are you going, Senator Esteves, are you going to correct this amendment?
Yes, they're working on it with legal right now, with all of the other amendments as well. So, guess we can move on, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
At your call.
Is there anyone else that, while he makes the changes to this written amendment, anyone else want to speak on this amendment? Senator Castro?
On this particular rounding, so I appreciate the author's amendment and the previous speakers, asking DRT, what the standard rounding rule or method is locally. But maybe, since I wasn't clear on what the answer was, but what is the industry standard, Mr. Director? And maybe more to my satisfaction, is something like this necessary? I feel we're going to get wrapped around the axle if we're doing 2 or 3 decimals. What's your opinion on the proposed amendment, Director?
I guess, before I answer that, I want to go back to Senator San Nicolas. I think these things maybe have been addressed already. I mean, through all the years on the BPT, this issue might have been addressed already, and there might be a ruling. I just need to go back and verify was there a ruling already on this particular issue, rounding off, in other words. So I'm trying to look at the statute real fast to see if there's anything that addresses this. I don't think it addresses any of these things, but these things normally come out, and when they normally come up, these issues, we actually have a group of people that will write a ruling on these things. And I just want to say that maybe I need to go and look at that. We have a lot of rulings that have been issued for many years, so this thing might have been addressed already. So your question is?
Well, actually, maybe you don't need to answer that. My point is maybe you can find out quickly so we don't delay unnecessarily and possibly cost us, valuable time. So if you want to delay to the author and get back to us soon and determine if there's a ruling on it, if not, maybe ultimately your opinion on whether or not this is necessary matters to me at least. Thank you.
Okay.
Senator Esteves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to highlight what was said. We asked, how is it computed? And we said, well, maybe this, and maybe sometimes they do this, and we don't really know, and maybe there's a ruling. And all I'm proposing, not trying to create drama here, Mr. Chairman, is that we have a standard formula that's accepted for rounding. It basically says this in law, this is how you round. I don't think it's a very complicated measure. I believe it just sets everybody to the same standard, so we're not having to go back. But I can tell you right now that it doesn't exist in statute that I've been able to find. And I just think it's important, not even just if we want to apply this to other taxes, that's fine. But I think looking at the law and identifying a hole in it that we can plug, I think is really quite valuable here, because we just heard it today. We really don't know how it's calculated. We really don't know, who did it. I'd be open to an amendment to only allow rounding down of taxes to be paid. I'd be fine with that if someone wanted to proffer it. But I think when you talk about rounding up and down, it's just a standard practice. But I think codifying it specifically in this tax is very important, because we really don't know, how much might be lost, how much people might be overpaying or underpaying with regards to those fractions of a cent.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. The only thing that needs to be added to this amendment, Senator Ada, if it's okay with you and the other colleagues, is just the language that says this is to add a new section 26707 to section 1 of this bill. If we're okay with that, since we had discussions and we can dispose of this, and the future amendments, if you can please add those that language. Okay, if you're okay. So we're on this Esteves amendment, Senator San Agustin.
Mr. Chairman, dealing with taxes, if you go to TurboTax, you go to whatever, when you're dealing in taxes, when you punch it in the numbers, it rounds off itself. You don't need to put it in law. when you're gonna pay your tax, anything over 5 is round off to the next number. Okay, so if we wanna add this on, I don't see a need for it. But if my colleagues believe there's a need, I know that Mr. Camacho can verify this when they're dealing in taxes, when you're computing your taxes, when they're doing, when somebody comes in there to pay something, when you put in the computer and you type it on, it'll round off for you. It doesn't require a scientist. You don't need a direct stipulation law, but I just wanted to make that comment. You know, if my colleagues want it, then fine, but I wouldn't support this. I'll let the system do it itself. The system is set up that way.
Thank you, Senator. Is that an objection to this amendment? Okay, there is an objection to this amendment. Are there anyone else that wishes to speak on the amendment? If not, all those in favor of the Esteves amendment, please raise your hands. Motion fails. Senator Esteves, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to reserve my time to make technical corrections on the language on the other amendments, so we're going to be printing out the fixed version, corrected versions.
Thank you. We're now back on the bill. Is there any Senator Uggan has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just asked the assistant within the hall to run copies of the amendment, so we can take a 1-minute recess, and then we'll be able to circulate. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We're in recess. The Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Ogden, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I know that the provision that we have before us, we are in the process of discussing Bill number 248-34, which would apply a sales tax. And we know that this body made a decision of increasing the liquid fuel tax, which became effective January 1st of this year. So we've heard some terminologies that's been applied here in this body over the course of the last several weeks of double taxation. And I certainly would hate to see us increase the taxes twice on our consumers, on our people, as it applies to the liquid fuel tax. So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to add a new sentence to the end of subsection 26701 to read after the 2%, provided, however, that this section shall not apply to the purchase of liquid or diesel fuel at a gas station located in Guam. And what that would allow, Mr. Chairman, is ensure that any application of sales tax does not apply to our consumers who purchase diesel or fuel at our gas service stations island-wide. And just for the information of the body, or let me leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. I think it's necessary that we ensure that we don't double tax our people as it applies to the purchase of these items. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Ogden. Senator Tom Adda.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly support this amendment. However, I think we probably also need to include the LPG gas that's sold for, residences, because those fuels, I believe, are taxed. I believe there's a liquid fuels, but at any rate, I would like to make the amendment shall not apply to the purchase of liquid. Gosh, I forget what it's called. Can we just take a brief recess?
Okay, we're in recess. The committee of the whole is back on. Senator Uggan, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I believe the previous speaker, if I recognize, is going to yield to an amendment. I just want, because he had the floor. Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
he did, but you're yielding to Senator Uggan? Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Senator. Mr. Chairman, based on the issue that was brought up by the previous speaker, he recommended that the language read, you delete the words "at a gas station" and insert the words "sold at sales outlets located in Guam." So that would be inclusive of the concern of the previous speaker. So it would read, the total provision would read, provided, however, that this section shall not apply to the purchase of liquid or diesel fuel sold at sales outlets located in Guam. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Does everyone understand the amendment? Senator Esteves?
He amended his own amendment, or was that an amendment to the amendment we have here?
That was his own amendment that he was amending.
Okay, if the sponsor of the amendment can please define, because is it defined at liquid or diesel fuel sold at these outlets as defined in the chapter?
Okay, Senator Uggan, do you yield to that question? And also, if you can also add, what about LP, liquid petroleum gas, LPG, right? Is that included in your amendment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And in response to the previous speaker, the reason why we are utilizing the term liquid or diesel fuel, and based on discussions with the previous mover of the amendment, that would be inclusive of LPG. But, Mr. Chairman and Senator, liquid fuel as defined in Title 11, Chapter 26-401, is inclusive of turbojet, jet engines, coal tar, vegetable ferments. It has an extensive list of application, and that's one of the reasons why my amendment would address specifically our consumers who purchase gas and liquid fuel at the service stations island-wide. And in this case, it would apply now to all the sales outlets. I hope that answers your question, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Anyone want to speak on Senator Uggan's amendment? Are there any objections to the amendment? Senator Torres, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the intent of the amendment and all of that, but I also think that in the grand scheme, when you look at all the commodities that will be subject to a sales tax, and if in fact the theory that this sales tax is so inconsequential in the grand scheme, then I think once we start down this road, if we're going to exempt this, I mean, the case can be made for everything else. Case can be made for every other thing that has a GRT attached to it, or a sin tax attached to it, or, you know, and at this point, I mean, are we going down the road of revenue enhancement? And if we are, then we're going to have to take the bold step to realize as much money as we can quickly to help infuse revenue into this government. So that's my only concern. I understand, you know, the sensitivity to that and the idea that, well, I've already paid, but I think that same principle applies to many, many other commodities, including the sensitivity towards exemptions on things that are typically exempted by sales tax in other jurisdictions. I don't know if I made myself clear, but generally I'm just saying that if you're going to do a sales tax, let's just swallow that giant horse pill, because I think that's kind of what we're facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, could we consider that as an objection?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. There is an objection to the Uggan amendment. Senator, would you like to close?
Thank you very much, Senator. Colleagues, I certainly hope that I would acquire your support in regards to this. And like was explained a little earlier, we did increase the liquid fuel tax on our people, which became effective as of January 1st. So if we're talking about not only 2.5 months shortly after that we're going to apply a sales tax to the same items purchased by our consumers, I certainly have a serious concern about that. And with all due respect to the previous speaker, Mr. Chairman, you know, when we look at this and we say a 2% is inconsequential, well, a 4-cent adjustment in liquid fuel tax on an annualized basis would generate the figure that was provided by administration officials, approximately $3.5 million from our people, from the consumers out there. And $3.5 million certainly is not inconsequential when it applies to our consumers out there and increasing the cost to them, and especially in light of the recent increase in the liquid fuel tax. So with all due respect to our colleagues, I ask for your consideration and your support of this amendment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify, I'm not making a case that it's inconsequential. I'm just iterating some points that were brought up earlier. But in fact, yesterday, I made the case about how this, in fact, is very impactful. So I just want to make that clear. That's not my position. It's just general sentiments. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. On the Uggan amendment, there has been an objection. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Motion passes. Senator Uggan, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I should proceed in requesting a copy be made of the next amendment. I could provide a copy to the chair, and if there's certain senators in the hallway that would like to get a copy, I could request that our Sergeant at Arms provide it. And Mr. Chairman, I only say that statement primarily because of the extensive nature of the amendment that will be proffered shortly. Senators and colleagues, we all know and acknowledge that Bill number 247, that's 34 LS, was publicly heard on Wednesday morning. And did you want to? That's why. I will provide the chair a copy, and then senators, please, if you would like individual copies, please signify. We can take a 3-minute break, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we'll take a recess to make copies, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Uggan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for the 3-minute recess so that we can, in fact, get copies of the proposed amendment to all of our colleagues. Mr. Chairman, Bill number 247-34 had a public hearing on Wednesday morning, and this is a provision that was relative to establishing education, health, and public safety as the top priorities of the government, and to recognizing the governor's authority to reorganize the executive branch of the government, to removing impediments to reorganization, and providing the governor the tools necessary for such reorganization, and referred to as the Government Priorities Act of 2018. Mr. Chairman, as we certainly continue to consider raising taxes and looking at trying to balance the requirement of reducing costs throughout the government of Guam, and also possibly generating some additional revenues for the government to keep its operations. I think there's one message that our people have been imparting to many of us in the room, and that is we need to look at cost reduction. We need to look at ways in which we can reorganize this government so that similar functions can be consolidated and agencies more or less restructured so that the priority, again, of this government focuses on education, public safety, and healthcare. So, Mr. Chairman, the proposed amendment that I have before you, and I'm asking our colleagues to consider this as a new section, Chapter 1A, Reorganization, and if you would like me to go section by section, certainly we can do that. The first subsection would be 2200 out of Chapter 1A, Title 5, reference to the definitions. And then if you would like to look through the remaining balance of the proposed measure, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask our colleagues for your consideration to allow the governor, provide the governor with this tool necessary to be able to reorganize and restructure our government moving forward, taking into consideration that there has to be some serious cost reduction, possibly some revenue enhancements, and allow for agencies to be consolidated so that we have a reorganized government of Guam with a focus on the 3 pillars: education, public safety, and healthcare. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask for your consideration, and I ask for the consideration of the members of the body. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Is there anyone who wishes to speak on the Uggan amendment? Senator Nelson? Oh, you don't have a copy yet. Okay, we'll take a brief recess. Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Uggan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Senators. You do have before you the proposal, like I alluded to a little earlier, and I'm open to any questions or concerns with regards to this particular proposal. Thank you very much again, Mr. Chairman and colleagues.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Are there any members who wish to speak on the Uggan amendment? Senator Lee, you're recognized. And then Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe perhaps for the benefit of those who might be watching or who haven't seen the amended version, I guess I have a question for the mover of this amendment. Does this language do anything to shorten or otherwise lessen the period, the protection of classified employees in the furlough process?
Senator Uggan, do you yield to that question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that question. With regards specifically to the question that was asked, as a matter of fact, the amendment that is before us is not inclusive of anything that would allow the governor to be able to directly furlough without following the existing process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Castro, you're recognized. Okay. Okay. Any other senator wish to speak on the Uggan amendment? Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the author will yield to a question on I guess with the priority number and how this, if the author can share with the body how this was determined with regards of how the priorities were classified, and I know it states here that it's allowing the governor to with the option to abolish these agencies with a priority number exceeding 300. So I just want to know what was the mechanism in place to determine how these were put in these categories.
Senator, would you yield?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that question. Senators, if I can ask you to refer to subsection 2202.2 with regards to the table. Group 1 specifically highlight the 3 priority areas of the government of Guam should this amendment pass and be signed into law, and that is education, health, as well as public safety. Group 2 enumerates other entities that I've also, from obviously as a sponsor of the legislation, has identified as critical services that need to continue in regards to the structure that is already in place. Group 3 now enumerates and it's inclusive of all the other agencies within and entities within the government of Guam. So in terms of how this would be processed or be implemented, if I can ask you to refer to subsection 2203, which is absorption of functions. It says the governor by executive order may direct the absorption of any or all of the functions of any one agency of the government listed in Table 1 with a priority number of 200 or higher by any agency or agencies of the government with a lower priority number. So what that allows is the governor of Guam to be able to look at the agencies and the entities within Group 3, and if in fact there are functions that are complementary or similar, could be absorbed directly into Group 1 or Group 2 entities. And if that decision is that that continues to be a critical service provided to the people of Guam, that will continue in that fashion. It's a tool. Please be very mindful, my colleagues, that it's a tool that's available to the governor to be able to reorganize this government based on whatever decision this body renders as it applies to this amendment. I hope that answers the question of the good senator. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Morrison, do you have anything else? No. Okay, thank you. Any other senator wish to speak on the Uggan Amendment? Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the mover of this amendment because we are in a serious cash shortfall on situation. We need to do, the governor has already been on record, the fiscal team, in saying that we need to, they intend to realign the expenditures for FY18 to reduce them by 47 million. And of course, it doesn't meet the entire 67 million shortfall, but it's what we need to do, and it's what the public absolutely wants to see how we can do this without hurting them, right? I mean, because our government is intended to help them and not to hurt them by cutting critical services. So I appreciate his prioritization. I just had some concerns at the public hearing when this bill was heard. It removes from the current process there is a current process for reorganization. This can occur now. The problem is it requires a public hearing, which actually, that's my issue with this amendment, but I think, I'm going to support the amendment. However, it does remove this public hearing and the notice to the people who will absolutely be affected by the authority that we are giving the governor by this amendment. It's a very broad authority to abolish agencies that have, existed for many years and have been given very detailed functions and things to accomplish and services to provide. So of course, I just think when you're going to take away services from the people, they should know that, and we should do it as with as much notice to them as possible. This bill also removes any type of legislative approval that has been in statute for years for reorganization. And it's very broad in that it allows you to abolish an agency, or allows the governor to abolish an agency. It allows the governor to absorb an entire agency from Group 2 into Group 1, or just particular functions of that agency. So I think if used well and used wisely and used, judiciously, it's a very good tool for a time like this. So I commend the author of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to rise in support of the proposed amendment. I want to commend the senator for introducing it, particularly at this juncture. I just want to echo for the record that it's consistent with the governor's letter dated February 23rd. In addition to that, throughout the last 2 weeks, we've heard time and time again the need to codify or to get something solid in writing that almost binds, that commits the administration to making the necessary cuts. And I think this is a genuine attempt to incorporate this particular piece into the existing legislation that the Senator San Agustin has introduced. In addition to that, I think it's also consistent with the March 6th Chamber of Commerce letter, particularly the second paragraph on Section 1, cost-cutting measures, the need to be able to prioritize and cut costs and contain costs without the necessity of additional legislative action, especially as we roll into an election cycle. So again, I want to commend the author for taking that step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. Any other senator wish to speak on the Uggan Amendment? Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple questions. And I guess the first one would be, under Group 2, we have the Guam International Airport, the GovGuam Retirement Fund, the Port Authority of Guam, and whatnot. Well, bottom line, those are autonomous agencies. or, you know, who accepts the Guam retirement. But let's take, for example, the Guam International Airport. I guess the question would be, since they are governed by their own board of directors and promulgate their own rules and regulations on how they operate, does the governor have that, I mean, are we going to allow the governor to have the ability to reorganize contrary to whatever mandates the board may have placed upon the entity they're responsible for any of the autonomous agencies? And that's a question I'm hoping the author would be able to, or the mover of the amendment would be able to at least enlighten us on.
Senator Ogden, will you yield to the question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that excellent question. You know, when you take a look at the provisions contained in there, yes, it would provide the governor of Guam with a broad authority to be able to absorb functions as well as entities within the government of Guam. And if, in fact, the governor sees fit that a particular function or entity is appropriate within any of these autonomous entities, then certainly that's a decision that he, as the administrator of the executive branch, would be provided by virtue of this legislation. So, Senator, I certainly hope that that answers your question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, then I guess the question is, then where is GPA in this? I'm looking for it, and maybe I'm just not seeing it. I mean, but we have several autonomous agencies, and the only one mentioned, again, are the Guam Airport Authority. I think the Port Authority is an autonomous agency. And so forth. So I'm just a little concerned, right, that without any guidance from those entities, right, whether we might be doing something contrary to what their existence is based upon, and that would be decisions that were made by the board of those entities, by the boards of those entities, right, and then giving just the governor the power to overrule all those see fit, as he sees fit. And I think the danger in that is not so much that that I would expect it, but, or, you know, that you would want the governor to do anything of malice or in retribution to something that may not be in his favor, depending on who. I'm just saying that these are autonomous agencies. They're governed by boards, right, to allow the governor to come in and have broad powers for the reorganization of these entities without the consent of the boards of those agencies, I think may open the door to some potential unintended consequences down the road. I put that out as a concern. The other concern that I have, of course, is the grouping of the Public Defender Service Corporation under Group 3, which is a lower priority than the Department of Law, the Prosecution Division. I would imagine, and again, I think it's been talked about much. It was talked about and addressed by the director of the Public Defenders Service Corporation, that really that would be unfair to give higher priority to a prosecution division of the Department of Law, you know, which would be in Group 1, and then the public defenders would be in Group 3, a much lower priority. Just want to note that. And there are others. This is one of those bills that I think it has had a public hearing, but it hasn't really been, and while it was heard, while some voices, actually I think there were only 3 or 4 voices at that public hearing, this really hasn't been vetted amongst us to really discuss a lot more in depth. And I raise concerns about that, because if we're just attaching this on now as an amendment without much further discussion in terms of, you know, a line-by-line type look at what is of a higher priority than other agencies, and I don't see anybody discussing it right now, and I'm hoping it will be discussed after I speak, right? Where should some of these other entities of the government of Guam be placed? I would move at this point to place the Public Defender Service Corporation at the same level of the Department of Law Prosecution Division, because again, if you're going to give the Prosecution Division that much more priority and then lessen the importance of the public defenders, then the public defenders is at a disadvantage. And so I would like to move the Public Defenders Division under Group 1 under Public Safety.
Thank you, Senator. There's an amendment to place Public Defender Corporation, which is in Group 3, to Group 1 under Public Safety. Are there any discussions on that amendment? Senator Atta?
Well, if we're going to move that particular department up there, then what about Department of Law, which is in Group 2?
And this is my point exactly, Mr. Chair, right? That we haven't had a serious vetting of these, of the way this is grouped and what prioritization it should take, aside from the public hearing that was held in which 3 or 4 people came up to testify. Amongst ourselves as policymakers, we have not sat down, and this is our first chance to actually talk about it, in which we need to really vet this out a lot more, with a lot more scrutiny than just, you know, let's get it on in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes even, and there we are, right? I think this involves a lot more consideration and perhaps even input from, well, we heard from public defenders, but even from the autonomous agencies. Not that I'm against giving the power to the governor to reorganize the executive line agencies, because that is definitely within his purview right now. What I'm talking about is the autonomous agencies who are governed by their own boards, and that might be disruptive to their whole operation. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oh, I guess we're still on my amendment to move the Public Defenders Service Corporation up into the same level of priority as the Prosecution Division of the Department of Law.
Got it. Thank you, Senator Espadon. On the Espadon amendment, Senator Uggan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the good senator for that amendment. You know, I'm certainly open, fellow colleagues, I'm certainly open to amendments, but we need to also recognize, and I continue to remind myself, that the governor of Guam needs to have the tools necessary to be able to reorganize and restructure this government and consolidate some services and functions. So I need to just keep my perspective in regards to that. A couple of statements that were made is with regards to reference to GWA and GPA, which is an excellent question, but this august body in the past had made a decision to be able to allow for elected representatives to sit on the Consolidated Commission on Utilities to oversee the operations of those 2 particular autonomous entities of the government of Guam. With regards to the airport and the Port Authority, by virtue of the appointment of the board members, that the governor of Guam still has oversight responsibilities over the other autonomous agencies other than GWA and GPA. So I wanted to provide that clarity. I understand that the good senator has expressed concerns about moving forward with this particular amendment. We've been discussing revenue enhancement measures with this body for now going on possibly 3 weeks. And when we're looking at such an impactful move on the part of this body, trying to identify revenues so that we can keep critical services, core functions of this government operating, there has to be that balance in terms of making sure that we let our people understand that in conjunction with any possible revenue enhancements, there's got to be reorganization and cost reduction. And the only way that we're going to be able to, in my opinion, realize a good measure of cost reductions is allowing the governor to have the flexibility to be able to reorganize this government and ensure greater efficiency and greater effectiveness in terms of the services being provided to our community. So I ask our colleagues to keep an open mind. Going back to the amendment, I have no objection with the amendment. I think the good senator has some excellent points in terms of making sure that the Public Defender Service Corporation is on par with the prosecution division within the Department of Law. It's an excellent point, and coming from the legal perspective and his background, I certainly respect that. And I do not oppose that amendment, but I believe very strongly that we need to, in addition to providing any measures to the governor, provide him with the tools necessary to be able to reorganize this government. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else on the Espadon amendment? Espadon amendment? Senator, would you like to close?
No.
Okay. Are there any objections? No objections? Senator Torres, did you have a?
I did want to raise an objection and take a vote. I think that there is, I understand the reorganization, but there are also consequences to positions, and that sort of thing should be vetted a little bit better, because we do understand that there are, in reorganization, it's the opportunity to not only eliminate, but to create. And while all good intentions are there are sometimes unforeseen consequences that maybe we're not so apparent on, and just rushing to this would give the governor that blanket authority to make the calls without really much discretion or input from other bodies. So that's where the danger, not the danger, but that's where some caution needs to be, where you're giving absolute blanket authority to the governor at his discretion. And sometimes that's not always the best. Things should be balanced and not, gone unchecked. That's all my point. Thank you.
Okay, we did gavel it in already, but if there is any objections to...
Mr. Chair, before we go on, and it just crossed my mind, excuse me, as I was watching the public hearing on this particular measure in bill form, I believe the representation made by the Public Defender's Service Office was that they fall under the jurisdiction of the courts. And I just need clarification from that, of that, because like I said, it just dawned upon me that they really operate under the court, the judicial branch. And so even though we may be giving the Public Defender Service Corporation general fund monies, I guess there needs to be a clarification, because if they do fall under the jurisdiction of the judiciary branch, then the governor should not have jurisdiction over the reorganization of the Public Defender's Service. And so I just need to perhaps take a moment, discuss that with legal counsel, or if anybody here who was watching or is involved with the public hearing, whether that is a true statement. So if I may just take a minute.
Okay, we'll take a minute recess.
Thank you.
The Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Espadon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. After talking with legal counsel, the question of whether the Public Defenders Corporation falls within the judiciary or under the executive branch, according to legal counsel, is not quite clear at this point. So at that, with that advice, or at least that input, I think it's safe. I feel at least a little better that we had approved the amendment and placing the Public Defenders Corporation in priority number one, priority group number one. I still have a few other things I'd like to say, but I think at this time I'd like to go ahead and relinquish the floor, and I'll reserve some time to come back later on, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. On the Uggan amendment, Senator San Agustin.
Mr. Chairman, I only have a few questions if the author can yield to the yield. And it's in reference to the OPA on the Office of Public Accountability is by an elected official. I honestly believe that any agency that is governed by elected officials be taken off the list, so they not even be considered. And the OPA is one of them, and even the Department of Education, which has an elected board, because then there'll be a conflict of the government. So I just wanted to ask that was the only thing I was concerned with. If they have an elected official, like the OPA and the Education Board, they'll be taken off the list at all, to be considered. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a few minutes and we'll get Senator Uggan back on. Okay, we're back on now. Senator Uggan, would you yield to the question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I know the question by the good senator is with regards to the Department of Education and the OPA being administered by elected officials. If I can refer everyone to the proposed subsection 2213, and it reads that these particular provisions shall not apply to an office or department under the supervision of an elected official. So in that particular case, we recognize the authority and the power by the people of Guam electing these particular individuals to these positions, so it will not affect these agencies. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator San Agustin, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do support the amendment.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else on the Uggan amendment? Senator Tom Atta?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in Section 5, I don't know what page this is, Section 5 of the bill pertaining to privatization. Right now, that Section 5 proposes to repeal the requirement of approval by the Legislatura en Guahan for privatization, and I would move that we delete Section 5 and maintain that requirement. And this was put in because of the concern that, for example, our port, the airport might possibly be privatized, and that was certainly not the will of the legislature when this provision was enacted, so I would like to maintain that requirement. And so then the motion is to strike Section 5.
Thank you, Senator Ada. On Senator Ada's amendment to the amendment. Anyone wish to speak on Senator Ada's amendment to the amendment? Senator Agan?
Just on the, I want to thank the good senator for that particular amendment. And it recognizes that this body continues to maintain oversight and authority over any privatization of government assets or functions. Just to bring to the attention of the members of the body, the last two lines, just be very mindful that any plan that is submitted in the existing code to the legislature, if no action is taken within 45 days, said plan or action shall be deemed approved. So there is a automatic clause within the existing code, so just FYI. But I do recognize the authority of this body in terms of any privatization. Ideally, obviously, I kept it in the legislation because I believe that that's a critical component of allowing the governor of Guam the flexibility to reorganize his government. But there's nothing that would dismiss the governor of Guam presenting the plan to this body for action. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Agan. Anyone else wish to speak on Senator Ada's amendment to the amendment? Are there any objections? No objections. Motion passes. So we're now still on the Agan amendment. Anyone else wish to speak on the Agan amendment? Senator Morrison?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, there's been concerns from some of my colleagues regarding I brought up earlier regarding the priority number of these agencies. And I thank the author for trying to explain how, or what was the mechanism for how these agencies were grouped. And in light of some of the concerns from my colleagues and how these numbers were, or agencies were prioritized, and understanding subsection 2204, giving the governor that broad power to abolish any agency under any priority number below 300, still concerning to me. So, Mr. Chair, I recall in the past when any agency or when an agency was being abolished, it was done through this body. And there was made it very clear to allow those agencies to provide some testimony through a public hearing, at least to ensure that we had that process exhausted. And yes, the agencies was transferred into another agency or absorbed by another agency, but at least the process was done through this body to abolish a specific agency. So with that, Mr. Chair, I move to strike subsection 2204.
Thank you, Senator. On Senator Morrison's amendment to strike sections 2204, Senator Agan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the good senator. I understand why he's moving for that particular provision to be deleted, but it's either we allow the governor to be able to reorganize this government and ensure that we realize some savings, and by virtue of the amendment that's before us, prioritize education, public safety, and healthcare. That's what we are looking at, Mr. Chairman. And by virtue of removing that particular provision, which is, to me, one of the central components or provisions in this legislation, because it would allow the governor to abolish an agency of which perhaps the function is no longer necessary in this government. Can we afford it? And it really comes back, Mr. Chairman, to understanding where we are today. And, you know, just based on some of the information that was discussed this morning during the tax reform forum, reorganization was part of the conversation at different tables. That our people out there recognize that there's this continual plea, we need money, we need revenues to be able to continue the operations of this government. But in the same breath, our people are insisting that we reduce the cost of government. And how do you reduce the cost of government? One option is reorganization. It's allowing for the consolidation of functions and agencies so that, in fact, we have a different government tomorrow that places education, public safety, and healthcare as priorities. That's what this measure would provide. And by virtue of taking away a central provision in this legislation, I don't believe that the governor would be provided all of the tools necessary to be able to consolidate and to reorganize and restructure our government so that we can continue to provide some of these entities, the priority agencies, with the resources that they need. I look at some of the things that have taken place over the course of the last week and a half. Mr. Chairman, we've received word from the governor's office about credit warning, furlough warnings, disconnection warnings, suspension warnings, cutting warnings, and also shutting down warnings. Those are part of parcel of what the governor has sent down by virtue of his statements or through his press releases, that we are in a dire financial situation. In one breath, we're discussing providing some resources, additional revenues. But our people are demanding that, in fact, we reduce the cost of government, and that's what this provision provides. If it means abolishing an agency and taking possibly those functions and putting it in a different entity, then that's the flexibility and the option that should be provided to the governor of Guam. Because one question is, can we afford it? Second question is, through reorganization, can we realize some serious cost reduction in the cost of government moving forward? And to me, the answer is yes. And this is part of the solution that we should present to the governor, and this is part of the solution that our people are insisting that we present to the governor. Give the governor the tools and the ability and the flexibility to be able to restructure this government so that we can realize some true cost reductions. Not reducing the cost of government by reducing the allotment for this fiscal year and then coming back next year and saying, okay, we're going to go back to business as usual. We have to change our mindset. And our mindset really should be, how can we ensure that we provide greater efficiency and effectiveness in terms of our government services being provided to our community, and also prioritize the core functions of this government, which incidentally is a requirement in the Organic Act: education, public safety, and healthcare. That's what this boils down to, Mr. Chairman, and I ask our colleagues I ask the mover of the amendment to reconsider his move to delete this particular provision, because the governor of Guam needs the tools and needs the authority to be able to reorganize this government so that coming into fiscal year 19, when we here in this body decide exactly what the allocation of the budget is, we no longer have to look at education as receiving additional reductions. We can now look at education as receiving what they either received this fiscal year in the budget initially, or give them additional resources, as well as public safety and as well as healthcare. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask the mover of the amendment to reconsider his motion to delete subsection 2204, and I ask our colleagues to please consider the position that I just outlined. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of inquiry, if the mover of the initial amendment would yield to a question. This is regarding subsection 2204, so the the abolition of government entities. My question is, with the discretion, what's the discretion for once an agency is abolished? Would that remaining appropriation go towards the big three priorities? Would it go directly towards health, education, and public safety?
Senator Morrison, do you yield to that question?
This is for the mover of
Oh,
the initial
mover.
amendment.
Okay, so Senator Uggan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And with the good senator from Umatec, I hope I can be provided an opportunity to respond. There is a provision here, subsection 2205, in response to the senator's inquiry, which reads transfer authority. And being mindful that we're talking about making reference to fiscal year 18. The governor is authorized to transfer the appropriation of any agency of the government which is abolished or function which is absorbed to any other agency of the government with a higher priority number. So it allows the governor to be able to take the budgetary allocation that was approved or is approved by this body and move it around so that there can be greater efficiency and retooling of the government entities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I thank the author for his response. And I also rise in opposition to this amendment to delete section 2204. Sujos Masi.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator on the Morrison amendment? There is an objection. Senator, you want to close?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this body, Mr. Chair, has established agencies, or I believe majority of these agencies by law. And I think the same should apply when we're abolishing or seeking to abolish the same agency created by this body. And Mr. Chairman, just recently we moved to or recessed so that we can have a public hearing regarding the governor's request to reduce the notice regarding the furlough notice from 90 days to 30 days to allow our workforce, the government workforce, to provide testimony regarding this bill, understanding fully that this would impact these folks or these employees. I think the author or supported that motion. Mr. Chairman, if you look at these agencies, many of these agencies have a classified workforce or have come through the classified system. And that's my concern. And I'm not trying to, I understand where the mover of this amendment is, but I'm concerned that the same reason why we moved to have a hearing for the 32-hour work week notice, reduce to 30, is because of this issue that how it will impact our workforce. There's a workforce attached to these agencies. So I do hope my colleagues will remain consistent in understanding why we motioned just recently to have those who will be impacted regarding the furlough notice for 30 days, or down to 30 days. And again, I go back, these agencies were established by this body, by this legislature, by this branch of government. And I do believe if it's going to be abolished, this same body should have that approval or clear this body before the governor moves forward with it. So I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. There was an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the Morrison amendment, please raise your hands. Motion fails. Senator Uggan, you still have the floor. Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Morrison, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an amendment to subsection 2204, and it will read, the governor by executive order and as authorized to enact duly passed or same sorry, Mr. Chair. Subsection 2204, the governor by executive order and as authorized through an act duly passed by Iles, Latour, and Guahan may abolish any agency of the government listed in Table 1 with a PN of 300 or higher. Again, Mr. Chair, we're not stopping the governor for proceeding with this authority to abolish any agency which he feels necessary. However, I still believe that if this body has the authority to establish or create an agency, it should still also have the same ability if it would be, any agency would be abolished. So I'm asking that my colleagues support this amendment, that at least should come back to this body for approval. Thank you.
Senator, can you just repeat your amendment, please?
The amendment would read on subsections 2204, the governor by executive order and as authorized through an act duly passed by Iles, Latour, and Guahan may abolish any agency of the government listed in Table 1 with a PN of 300 or higher.
Okay, thank you. Senators, understand the amendment? Senator Agan, you recognize?
Just so that I don't necessarily repeat some of my previous comments, Mr. Chairman, I certainly oppose this measure. And you know, one thing about the mover of the amendment, I recognize that this body can establish agencies. This body can delete and abolish agencies. But that's during regular times. Mr. Chairman, our government is not facing a status quo or a regular budgetary cycle. Our government is going through some serious fiscal challenges. The question we have to ask ourselves is, do we recognize that? And if we do, then yes, some form of revenue enhancements will have to be considered by this body. But we also need to provide the governor of Guam with the flexibility and the tools to be able to realize some efficiencies. You know, one thing I really do not like about certain circumstances, Mr. Chairman, because I'm sure that some of this have been brought to a number of members in this body, is when we have an employee in this government that does not have the equipment or the tools because of budgetary concerns. That's what the core of this legislation is. Let's focus on what is required by the Organic Act, and let's focus on what the people of Guam want us to focus on. And that is education, public safety, and healthcare. And if that requires that we abolish some of these other agencies and consolidate the functions and the classified personnel, then so be it. And you know, one thing about this, Mr. Chairman, is that every fiscal year, this body is tasked with the responsibility of passing a budget. If this body does not agree with the recent action or the action of a governor, then this body can enact legislation that will say, no, contrary to your actions by virtue of this proposal, should it pass into law, we recognize that this is something that has to be part of the structure of the government of Guam. This is not taking away that authority, because every year we have to consider the budget. Every year we come back and take a look at the government of Guam structure and we say, okay, how much more, if we have the resources, can we give to education? How much more can we give to public safety? How much more can we give to healthcare? But right now, we're not giving more. Right now, the situation calls for reducing the allocation for this fiscal year. We had DOE come in, even in their testimony, in some of the public hearings of legislation, asking and pleading, we need to at least not cut further than what they've already identified, because otherwise it would go into the classroom. We've also had concerns about the agency that you oversee, Mr. Chair. We need to eventually look at that and find out how we can provide additional resources so that they can operate. But guess what, Mr. Chairman? If we continue to operate the same way we have, then the cost of government will not be reduced. And we ask ourselves, where's the efficiency? Where's the effectiveness? To me, the big challenge I'm faced with right now, Mr. Chairman, is that we have 2 fire stations that were shut down, supposedly because of budgetary concerns. We had our Agutnia precinct shut down or closed based on concerns about budgetary considerations. That's what we are faced with. We need to give this governor and the next governor, whoever that may be, the tools to be able to reorganize this government. And if this body in the future feels that that decision and that action is contrary to what the community wants and is willing to pay for, then ultimately it's up to this body down the road to make that decision. But right now, we need to take some very serious action on passing legislation that would allow or provide the authority to the governor of Guam to consolidate and to reorganize this government, so that once again, any resources that can be identified will be given to the core agencies of this government, which we all know is in Group 1, Education, Public Safety, and Healthcare. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Any other senator on the Morrison amendment? There was an objection. So all those in favor of the Morrison amendment, please raise your hand. Motion fails. Senator Morrison, you have the floor. I think he has one more amendment. Senator Morrison, are you done? Okay, thank you. Senator Tom Atta.
Mr. Chairman, we've been at this since 1 o'clock, and if we're going to try and finish the bill tonight, I would recommend that we either take an hour break, or we take a break and come back Monday morning to finish off this bill. But we've got to do one or the other. So I would move that we recess until Monday at 9 a.m.
Okay. So motion to recess?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Maybe 10 o'clock because we have the flag raising on Monday at 8.
It's at 8 o'clock. It's at 8 o'clock.
Senator?
The motion then is to recess until 9 o'clock on Monday.
Okay. Any objections to motion to Monday at 10 a.m.? Sorry, 9 a.m. 9 a.m. Any objections? No objections? We're in recess till 9 on Monday.